Cois and war to tagan a lealty. Fagen muskeli dongan a shoti. Tan goa.
Beneath the lament of storms. Love and power in the Tempest of the Isles. The secret legacy of the ancients. Elara, Whitford. Epigraph. These waters, rolling from mountain springs with a sweet inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused. William Wordsworth. Lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey. Summary. In the Scottish Isles, where the echoes of legend ride on northern winds, Dòrnait MacCuinn is determined to escape the fate her family has laid out for her. Born into a respected lineage, she refuses to be a pawn in the clan's political games. With a heart scarred by the past, she walks away from her family, seeking a love that isn't bound by alliance or convenience. On the other side stands Aodhgall MacCraith of Rùm, chieftain of his clan and a fierce warrior, who intends to bend her to his will and claim her hand in marriage. But Dòrnait, more cunning and resolute than he expects, will not be easily subdued. Between them erupts a clash of wills, where passion and pride entwine in a dangerous conflict. Yet both are bound by an ancient curse. Nearly a century earlier, Lady Tuathla Cambrach MacCraith cursed her cruel husband Torcall Ceannfhionn MacCraith before drowning in the cold waters of the fjord. Her curse echoed across the sea. No MacCraith would thrive without a Cambrach at their side, and the MacCraith bloodline would suffer until one of their own sacrificed themselves for true love. Now Aodhgall MacCraith must face the weight of that curse, which threatens Dòrnait's life. As their fates entwine, they must confront not only the secrets of the past, but the shadow of a destiny carved in betrayal. Beneath the lament of storms is a tale of love, honor, and sacrifice, where the echoes of ancient Celtic myths collide with the greatest offering of all, a true love strong enough to break the chains of a fate forged in treachery. Can love and sacrifice shatter the curse that has marked their bloodlines for generations? Prologue. Between Rùm and Aodhgall, islands of the north. O wild west wind, breath of autumn, you who sweep the dead leaves, like ghosts fleeing from a sorcerer, carry my dead thoughts through the universe, like withered leaves that may bring forth a new birth. Percy Bysshe Shelley, Ode to the West Wind. Nearly a century ago, when mist veiled the coasts of the fjord between Rùm and Aodhgall, and the breath of the highlands still mingled with the whispers of the ancient gods, a curse was born, woven from the blood of pride and pain. Lady Tuathla Cambrach MacCraith, daughter of noble warriors and granddaughter of the lords of Aodhgall, had been given in marriage to Torcall Ceannfhionn MacCraith, chief of the powerful MacCraith clan of Cradmer. She was barely 26 winters old, yet her spirit was firmer than the stones of the castle she called home. Beautiful, proud, and courageous, Tuathla never bowed to a world that measured a woman's worth by the fertility of her womb. But in that land of fragile alliances, where crowns were forged from steel and convenience, her barrenness became her doom. Though she raised Torcall's children as her own, she could not keep his love or his respect. Like barren livestock, she was declared useless. One gray morning, in the pitiless silence of the tides, Torcall took her to a lonely rock in the sea, feigning compassion, masking cruelty. There he left her bound, as the waters rose with the tide. He did not want the scandal of a formal repudiation. He preferred the guise of an accident. But Tuathla, even in the face of death, did not beg. With lips numbed by the wind, she raised her voice with a fury that seemed to echo in the bones of the sea. I curse you, Torcall Ceannfhionn, you and all who come after. As you let me die for being barren, so shall your lands be barren. As you bind me to this rock, so shall your clan be bound to the Cambrach. No MacCraith shall thrive without a Cambrach beside them. And this curse shall endure, until one of yours gives their life for one of mine for love. It is said that even Torcall, in his cruelty, trembled for a moment upon hearing those words. And that the sea, dark and ancient, carried them into its depths. Since then, the MacCraith lineage has known more tragedy than glory. And in every generation, someone turns again to the rock in the fjord, wondering if the price of that betrayal has yet been paid. Chapter 1. Spring of 1610, Lowlands of Scotland. Come to me in the silence of the night. Come in the quiet speech of dreams. Come with soft cheeks and bright eyes. Like sunlight on a still stream. Return in tears. O memory, hope, love of vanished years. Christina Rossetti, Echo. The night was as dense as black velvet, embroidered with flickering stars that seemed to watch with discreet curiosity the carriage hurrying along the damp roads near Torvallen. The creaking of the wheels was swallowed by the slumbering trees, and only the wind seemed to know what was happening. A noble woman, stubborn and determined, was fleeing the fate others had laid out for her. Dòrnait MacCuinn, 24 years old, kept her gaze fixed on the carriage window, though nothing could be seen in the darkness. Her profile, faintly lit by the lantern inside, revealed a firm chin and eyes where both resolve and doubt flickered. She had been born into the traditions of the clans, raised as a piece in a game she had never chosen to play, but tonight would not be another move made for her. Tonight was her own. "Are you having second thoughts?" asked a soft, measured voice beside her. Aodhgall Finlaiche, son of the Earl of Tuathla, spoke without mockery or tenderness, but with a neutrality that could be mistaken for courtesy or respect. Dòrnait turned her face to him with a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I couldn't be happier," she replied, though her fingers nervously played with the buckle of her glove. Aodhgall nodded, without another word. His calm stood in stark contrast to the tension wrapped around Dòrnait like an invisible cloak. He accepted the risk with the composure of a politician measuring every move. He didn't love her, and she didn't expect him to. But he respected her, and that in the world she knew was more than most women could hope for. The carriage turned down a side path. The church where the ceremony would take place was remote, carefully chosen to avoid unwanted witnesses. No banns had been announced, no decree issued. The marriage would be legal but secret, as if both understood that they were sealing not a vow of love, but an act of defiance. Dòrnait took a deep breath. The memory of her mother, beautiful, resigned, broken, passed through her mind like a familiar ghost. Marriage had withered her like frost on moorland flowers. Dòrnait had sworn she would never let the same happen to herself. "If I had to marry," she whispered to herself, "it would be to a man of my choosing." Aodhgall turned toward her, as if he had heard her thoughts. "And you, Aodhgall? Do you regret it?" "Not at all." The answer was immediate. He was pragmatic, and perhaps that was exactly why she had chosen him. He wouldn't try to bend her. He wasn't interested in her dowry. He didn't need her name. A distant thunderclap broke the silence, a harbinger of a storm yet to come. "You don't know my brothers," said Dòrnait, lowering her voice. It wasn't a complaint. It was a warning. Aodhgall offered a faint smile, more polite than confident. "It wouldn't be the first time I've made enemies among the clans." "They're not enemies," said Dòrnait. "They're wolves. And they're hungry." The church finally appeared, solitary among old oaks and moss-covered stones. The bells were silent. There would be no celebration, no applause. Only vows spoken in the shadows, and a new bond setting in motion consequences yet unseen. The heart of Dòrnait was beating strongly. Not for love. For the price of freedom. Chapter 2. The forest, just before dawn. The church was left behind, silent as a promise sealed in the dark. The carriage now moved more slowly, the horses snorted in exhaustion and the wheels groaned against roots that rose like twisted fingers from the damp earth. Dòrnait had remained silent since the ceremony. She clutched a small object tightly in her fingers, an old oval-shaped amulet, its Celtic engraving worn by time. It was her mother's necklace. Her final wish. Promise me, Dòrnait, don't marry the way I did. Not out of fear. Not out of duty. Only for love. She had broken her promise. A sharp pang shot through her chest. Beathagan at her side looked content but detached, as if he had just concluded a well-negotiated deal. His gloved fingers brushed against hers, searching for some sign of tenderness. Dòrnait pulled away slightly. Does it hurt? He asked, puzzled. My neck. She lied. But it was her conscience that tightened. Then the carriage jolted violently. A shout from the driver. A sharp whistle. The horses whinnied in panic. What's happening? Beathagan shouted, already rising. We're under attack, Dòrnait murmured, her voice steady, eyes blazing. Her heart didn't beat from fear, but from something sharper, a premonition. The next moment was chaos. A dark figure kicked open the carriage door. Another man dropped down from the roof. Highlanders, no doubt. Their disheveled tartan clothes, long hair, the smell of moss and wet leather. And yet one of them, the tallest, the slowest to move, didn't act like the others. Dòrnait lunged for her travel bag and pulled out something Beathagan hadn't expected, a curved blade dagger, sharp and carefully sheathed. Do you have a weapon? She shouted with irony without looking at him. What? I know. You do. Dòrnait didn't answer. She launched herself with surprising skill at the nearest attacker, and though she was quickly disarmed, her attack hadn't been useless, the gesture had been seen. And admired. The man watching her, the Highlander who still hadn't attacked, approached with slow, deliberate steps. He was a mountain of flesh and muscle, with eyes dark as scorched heather, and an island accent that filled the air like the smoke of Uisci Bitha. Fiery little thing, he murmured. Do you always pull knives on your honeymoon? Get your hands off me. Dòrnait spat, feeling his grip on her arm as he kept her from standing. Not a chance, darling, he said in a low voice, without violence, but with no room for argument. His proximity was overwhelming. He smelled of earth, of well-worn leather and something else, a fragrance almost sweet like pine resin mixed with sweat. Dòrnait, in the midst of panic, felt a shiver that wasn't entirely fear. Beathagan was struggling uselessly at the back of the carriage. The thieves ignored him. All eyes were on her. Who are you? Dòrnait asked, not expecting an answer. The man smiled, showing perfect cruel teeth. Someone who doesn't kneel before judges in Edinburgh, he whispered, and who doesn't pass up an opportunity when it presents itself with fire in its eyes and a dagger in hand. Dòrnait's gaze hardened. Then you don't know me. Not yet, he said. And then he lifted her onto his shoulder like a sack of grain, at Beathagan's desperate shout. Dòrnait struggled, but the contact of his body with hers was like fire set alight in the damp night. The necklace slipped from her neck with a soft jingle, lost among the leaves. The broken promise, the path changed. And on the horizon, the first light of day. The fog was starting to lift among the trees, and with it, the illusions. Beathagan continued to struggle futilely against the two men holding him, his face contorted not with rage but with pure terror. The man holding him laughed, as he heard him babbling titles and threats. Do you have any idea who we are? He yelled. We're guests of the king. You think you can kidnap her? The Highlander, still holding Dòrnait, looked up. His expression, once tense and controlled, became cold, almost indifferent. Only his eyes, dark and full of history, answered with something more than mockery. I already have what I wanted, he said, without raising his voice. And then, with a single order murmured in Gaelic, the others released Beathagan. The nobleman collapsed to his knees, gasping, trembling. Dòrnait, still held, looked at the man who had just sealed her fate with a sentence. Am I supposed to thank you? She spat, her lip torn, her voice whole. He watched her for a moment. Not with lust, not even with triumph. With calculation. I'm not going to do what you're thinking. I simply don't find it amusing to have another dagger stabbed in my back. She lowered her gaze for a second, seeing the dark blood on the man's leather vest. The wound she had inflicted on him no longer bled, but there it was, a sign of her resistance and her failure. Behind them Beathagan rose like a ghost. He looked at Dòrnait, but did not take a single step toward her. Not one. "Beathagan," she shouted as the Highlander began to carry her away. He didn't respond. He couldn't. What had been between them, the respect, the alliance, the illusion that he could protect her or even try, evaporated in that instant like dew in the sun. Dòrnait stopped fighting. Not from surrender, but from understanding. That man, Aodhgall MacCraith, even though she didn't yet know his name, was not simply a highwayman. His eyes were those of a man who understood the weight of power, who knew how to distinguish between a jewel and a key piece in a larger game. Her mother's amulet was still lost in the grass. Dòrnait noticed it too late, far too late. Another promise, lost in the shadows of the highlands. When the group ventured deeper into the forest with her, the dawn finally broke through the trees. And as Beathagan stayed behind alone, dirty, useless, Dòrnait was entering the heart of a conflict she didn't fully understand, but one that had already chosen her. Chapter 3. Path to the Heart of the Mist. The night unraveled over the moors, like a prayer abandoned in the dark. High on the hills of Aodhgall, the wind carried ancient voices, echoes of druids who no longer walked the earth but still whispered among the oaks and heathers. It was a moonless night, devoid of comfort, barely broken by the creaking of the war-horse that ascended with steady steps through the shadows. Dòrnait MacCuinn lay asleep against the chest of the man who had ripped her from the path of sin, like a wolf steals its prey. But he was no wolf. Or not only that. Aodhgall MacCraith of Rùm was something darker and more noble at once, a man forged by blood oaths, ancestral loyalties, and the unbreakable weight of duty. Wounded in the side by the dagger the maid had managed to stab him with, like Judith facing Holofernes, his face remained impassive. The pain kept him alert, but it was not the pain that kept him vigilant. It was her. Dòrnait. The girl, the daughter of the MacCuinns, raised among psalms and silks in the lowlands, seemed in that moment a bewitched creature. Her breathing was light, her hair smelled of wet heather and peat smoke. Her forehead rested upon the MacCraith tartan, unaware that when she woke her world would never be the same. The dew began to weave the ferns when she opened her eyes. Confused. Then furious. "Who are you? What do you want from me? Is this a kidnapping?" she snapped, her voice still trembling with sleep. Aodhgall glanced at her sideways. "Not now, Dòrnait." "You know who I am," she accused, and the dew seemed to freeze. "Did you think I didn't know who you were?" The silence between them wasn't simple obstinacy. It was an invisible contest, a duel between two prides. He, hardened by campaigns against the Cambrach. She, trained in the most subtle art of the court, cunning disguised as innocence. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He had taken her from Beathagan Finnlach's arms not out of desire, though desire burned beneath his skin like dormant embers, but out of necessity. Dòrnait's lineage, as ancient as the MacCraiths, was a political treasure. And the honor of her clan, threatened by the frivolity of marriages without blood or land, demanded his intervention. "My brothers will kill you," Dòrnait said, with a bravado that trembled on her lips. Aodhgall laughed. "I wouldn't make plans for any Cayley just yet, my little bloodthirsty one." She straightened like a deer sensing the hunter's blade, but not yet running. "Are you mocking me? Only your choice of suitor." Then she understood. It hadn't been a random ambush. He had sought her out. He knew her. He had been following her. "How did you know where I'd be?" she asked in a low voice, more dangerous than a shout. "The spirits of the forest told me." She didn't reply. On the cross of her neck, the small crucifix shone for a moment in the rising sun, as if seeking protection. The landscape began to change. In the distance, the highlands rose like the back of a sleeping god. The clouds tangled in the peaks and the lakes, dark as closed eyes, reflected a sky that had yet to decide whether to bless or curse. Dòrnait gazed at that world with wonder. It was not the land of her childhood. Not neat gardens or Roman stone roads. This was ancient. Terrible. Sacred. There were abandoned Celtic crosses among the ferns, stone tombs with lichens that had no name. And in the wind names of forgotten gods, Brigid Lu Apona. The girl swallowed. "What do you plan to do with me?" "Save you from yourself," he answered with a bitterness that sounded like truth. But neither he nor she knew yet that within the folds of this journey, something more than a political destiny would be sealed. For there are paths, like the old trails of the Highlands, that cannot be undone without getting lost. And that night, when they camped by a sacred stream where yew trees still grow, trees of the dead, Dòrnait dreamed of an old woman dressed in white with eyes covered by a veil. In her lap a sword and a withered rose. And upon waking, the cold had changed. It was no longer foreign. It was part of her. Under the sign of the living stones. Dawn arrived in the Highlands like a whispered prayer to the ancient gods. A pearly mist floated over the land, as if the veil of the otherworld had slipped across the face of reality. Amidst the sleeping heathers and the murmur of the stream, Dòrnait MacCuinn awoke to the distant call of a lone raven perched atop a dolmen. That black bird with eyes like burning coals seemed an emissary of Morrigan, the goddess of war and fate. Dòrnait slowly sat up. The stones of the circle surrounded her like ancient guardians, moss-covered, wise, vigilant. She felt a strange tingling in her chest, as if the very earth whispered beneath her. The night before she had dreamed of her mother dressed in white, walking among spirals carved in stone, whispering words in a forgotten Gaelic. The Highlander's wound, the blood, the fire, the gaze of steel. None of it faded from her mind. That man was not like the others. He was neither a knight nor a barbarian, but something in between. As though he belonged to a lost lineage, one born from the roar of war and the magic of the hills. She shuddered. "Today," she murmured, barely a breath, "I must flee." But the stones, firm and ancient, seemed unwilling to let her go. The morning passed with the scent of wet peat and burnt branches. The men of the raider, wrapped in wool cloaks and accustomed silences, watched without speaking. They did not seem like mere soldiers. There was a ceremonial air about them, as if they served not a man but a cause woven in secrets. The raider emerged from the thick brush. He stood tall, his wound covered, though the bandage still bled at his side. He walked like a wounded warrior, refusing to fall. His face revealed an iron determination and fatigue wrapped in pride. "We must leave," he said in a deep voice. "Before the clouds cross the valley, and the rain washes away our tracks." She stared at him, unmoving. "And if I refuse?" He stopped in front of her, the shadow of the menhir casting itself between them like an omen. "Then the stones will decide." He looked at the circle that surrounded them, and added in a softer tone, as if invoking an ancient law, "You shouldn't have sat there. There are those who believe that whoever sits in the circle of the Fai is bound to fulfill their destiny, whether they like it or not." She did not respond. In her chest, the echoes of her mother, the fury of her lineage, the wound of abandonment, and the uncertain warmth of an unwanted admiration wove together like threads of a tapestry she didn't know how to interpret. And yet she walked with him. They crossed valleys where deer hid among giant ferns, and the trees whispered voices not of the wind. In the distance, a fallen dolmen pointed the way like an altar ruined by the passage of centuries. Dòrnait, deep down, knew she was no longer the same woman who had crossed the doors of the ballroom in Edinburgh. Something in these lands was transforming her. The question was, would she become a broken woman like her mother, or a legend? Chapter 4. The Fortress and the Wounded Wolf. The waning moon disappeared behind a curtain of clouds when the party of riders, like shadows in the mist, reached the wooden stairs leading up to the elevated gate of Dunbray Castle. The walls, blackened by centuries of salt wind and siege, rose like the bones of a sleeping titan. It was an ancient stronghold, built not only with stone but with blood, broken loyalties, and silenced oaths. Aodhgall MacCraith felt the weight of fatigue and the dull burn of his wounded side, as if a demon from the hills had branded him with a hot iron. The bandages no longer bled, but each step was a pulse of fever creeping up his spine. Still, he moved with the certainty of a leader. The stairs, as in any well-thought-out fortress, could be dismantled or set on fire in the event of an invasion. Defense was woven into the very architecture. When they crossed the threshold, the warm breath of the interior enveloped them like a shroud of welcome. Home. Or at least, the closest thing a wandering wolf could afford. Dòrnait, standing tall despite the journey, cast a critical glance around. The armory, the faded tapestry, the low oak beams. She showed no astonishment. Her noble blood would not allow her to admit weakness. Then, without transition, she confronted him, fury burning in her eyes like flames on dry peat. "Where is he? I demand to see your lord right now." The word demand brushed her skin like a dagger. "Demand," he replied in an icy voice. "Watch your tongue, girl. Here, your status is no higher than that of a hostage." She straightened even further. "How could I forget? I was kidnapped by a handful of barbaric Highlanders." Aodhgall grabbed her arm, his fingers firm, not cruel but not gentle either. "I don't like that word," he said with a sharp tone. "Don't use it again." She saw the crack in his composure and smiled, pleased. "Does the truth hurt too much?" He swept his gaze over her body with an intense look, as if measuring the distance between desire and fury. "Would you like me to be a barbarian?" "How dare you?" "There aren't many things I wouldn't dare. And you'd better remember that." He made a gesture. The men and servants scattered like leaves swept by the wind. Dòrnait did not ignore the silent command. "Who do you think you are? What do you think? I'm your host." Dòrnait's disbelief was like an invisible slap. "That's impossible." "It is. I am the Lord of Rùm." The silence that followed was thick as the fog in the sacred tombs. She judged him with the eyes of the court. She didn't see a refined noble but a hardened warrior. But what she didn't know was that his lineage was sustained by the edge of the sword and the will of the gods. "Why have you brought me here?" "You'll know soon enough." "I'll never marry you." Her determination was fire. He responded with ice. "I don't remember asking you to. A man like you wouldn't ask. He would simply take." He stepped closer, the shadow of his wound tightening his gestures. "And what kind of man am I?" She didn't step back. "The kind of man who would kidnap a lady and drag her to his fortress without caring what dreams he's destroyed. He would have made you miserable. It was my choice." He didn't quite understand why she clung to that rage. His life had been governed by forced decisions, yet she defended her small act of freedom as if it were a sacrament. "So you don't want to force me?" "No." She tilted her head, doubtful. "So this is about Terbert. You want to use me to get revenge?" He didn't answer immediately. He just stared at her, and she knew she had hit the mark. Dòrnait wasn't just beautiful, she was perceptive. He would have to be careful. "You won't get anything. We barely know each other. I'm not valuable to him." "But I do know him," Aodhgall replied. He remembered the day Terbert had come to Rùm with false banners while he was away, how he had taken Cradmer, his ancestral castle, with empty promises and knives in the shadows. Since the day of his father's funeral, Terbert had stalked him like a hungry shadow. "Why didn't you go to the king?" Bitterness slipped out of the corners of his mouth. "I did. And I paid for it. You kidnapped me for nothing. Terbert won't trade me for Rùm." "Don't underestimate your value, Dòrnait." The words escaped him without thinking, and she claimed them with a contained emotion. "I know my value." Something ancient resonated in her words. As if she spoke not just for herself, but for all the invisible women in men's stories. The argument ended when he, without a word, lifted her in his arms. She protested, but her wound flared up again like a curse. "It will reopen," he murmured. "You're moved by my pain, prisoner. I don't care. You can bleed out if that's what you want." He opened the door to a bare room, scarcely furnished. Dunbray Castle, once the home of ancient lords, was now a shell of what it had been. The stone spoke of past eras, but the damp and worn beams spoke of the present, a time of stripping and resistance. He laid her down on the bed. "Is this where I'll sleep? Would you prefer my bed?" "Never." He leaned over her, dangerously close. The air between them vibrated like a taut string. Desire was a flame threatening to break his control. But he wasn't a man who took what wasn't offered. He never had been. He pulled away sharply, furious with himself. He would need her to achieve his goals. But he wouldn't break her by force. He would make her his, yes. With patience. With strategy. Because if Dòrnait MacCuinn stood in his way, then he wouldn't show mercy either. The echo of confinement. On the third dawn since her confinement, Dòrnait MacCuinn found herself standing at the edge of the narrow tower window, gazing at the steep drop that separated her from the sea. The cliffs of Cradmer, shaped by centuries of wind, seemed to whisper ancient litanies, as though the spirits of the Druids still roamed among the mists of the Aodhgall Strait. The water below churned with the fury of an aggrieved Celtic god, and the seagulls circled, white as penitent angels, foretelling an uncertain fate. She had tried to escape on the first day, barely 5 minutes after that man, the chief with a gaze as sharp as steel and a voice like molten iron, left her in the room. 2 sentinels, as tall as oaks and as firm as runic stones, blocked her way with their bodies. 1 would have sufficed, but 2 was a signal. It wasn't just about surveillance, but ritual domination. One of them, a veteran with a weathered face and eyes still lit with the youth that refuses to fade, led her back to the room firmly but without cruelty. "The Lord prefers that you enjoy his hospitality in your chamber, milady," he said, with that tone of false courtesy masking blind obedience. "Hospitality? Is that what we call kidnapping now?" she replied, her voice haughty like that of a Saxon queen on the scaffold. "Come now, girl, don't take it so badly." "And how should I take it, when you lock me away like a heretic in a cell? Think of it as a retreat. A seclusion. When the Lord is ready, he'll call for you." Her lips pressed together. Not out of fear, but from the humiliation of being subjected to the whims of a Highlander, as rugged as he was attractive. What game of the gods had thrown her into the arms of Aodhgall MacCraith? Where had this man been in the perfumed courts of Edinburgh, where men wore lace and spoke with poisoned tongues? He was different. Too real. A statue of flesh sculpted with the blood of warrior ancestors. The echo of his presence, like a perfume of resin and metal, still lingered in the upper chamber where she had been confined. Sometimes in the gloom, Dòrnait found herself reliving that moment when she thought he would kiss her. And for a moment, she had wanted it. Like Icarus, she had felt the warmth of the sun before falling. The sin of desire, one that even saints cannot silence, burned under her skin. But it wasn't love. It was a trap. He didn't seek her heart, but her lineage. He wanted to use her as a pawn to reclaim his castle. A castle lost for honor and regained through cunning. In that, he wasn't so different from the courtiers she despised so much. For 2 whole days she waited, gazing at the sea, which was her only company. The horizon seemed endless, and yet it kept her captive. Like in the old legends where water fairies trap mortals in illusions of foam. The only souls who crossed the threshold of her prison were soldiers with no history, a servant named Cilias who spoke as if her tongue were enchanted, and 2 clumsy youths who brought a wooden tub and a pitcher of water smelling of heather. The room, though modest, had its ancient dignity, pine walls that whispered to the wind, a bed with humble but clean sheets scented with wild lavender. The floor was covered with fresh reeds, still green, as if the earth itself were trying to comfort her. A small fireplace crackled softly at night, like a faithful heart that never abandoned her. There, amidst the smoke and silence, sometimes Dòrnait prayed. To the Virgin Mary. To Brigid, the saint and goddess. To anyone who might listen. But on the third day, the air became unbearable. The walls seemed to close in. The tower, from the outside, was little more than an outer turret, raised as a sentinel of the rectangular fortress. From the window she could see the sea and beyond, the moss-covered cliffs and the ancient forests where deer still ran free as in the times of Cernunnos. When the door opened, her hopes revived. There they were, Alastair and Echan, her two guards. "Aren't you going to block my way today, Alastair?" she asked with irony, as one who dares fate. "No, milady, not today. The Lord awaits you in the hall for breakfast." A change. A crack in fate. With the haughty elegance that came naturally to her, she lifted her head and descended the spiral staircase, her footsteps echoing like bells on the stone. The great hall, if it could be called that, was as austere as a cloister. Dry reeds on the floor, whitewashed walls, bare beams. A fireplace was the only queen of the place, with rustic benches, candles, and iron sconces. There were no tapestries, no carpets, no luxury of low castles. But there was something else, an ancient presence, that of generations of chiefs who had ruled with sword and word. And there he was, with his back to the window, the sun tinting his brown hair with streaks of gold. Like a king without a crown, like a warrior from the songs of Oisin. When he turned, his blue eyes met hers, and it was as if a secret door opened in her chest. Something had changed. The shadow of illness veiled his face. It wasn't just pride that had kept him distant, it was pain. "You've been sick," Dòrnait said without thinking, surprised by the tenderness that slipped into her voice. He shook his head firmly, hardening his features even further. "No. Just other matters to attend to." He was lying. And she knew it. Because the pride of the Highlander was stronger than stone. And so was his silence. But in that moment, Dòrnait understood something. He wasn't a myth or a monster. He was a man. One marked by his wounds, just like her. And that truth, simple, human, heartbreaking, struck her harder than any words. The great stone hall of Dunsagothan smelled of burning peat and ancient dampness, as if time had stagnated within its grey walls, partially covered with faded tapestries depicting forgotten legends of Christian saints and heroes from the Finn cycle. Above the central flagstone, a modest fire burned, casting little light on the faces and throwing long shadows on the walls like watching specters. The vaulted ceiling resonated with the echo of their own silences. "Aye," murmured Dòrnait, and the words died in her throat, smothered by a blush that burned her cheeks like a hidden ember under snow. Aodhgall, still standing by the Lord's table, watched her closely. Beneath his words a cold edge crept. "You defended yourself well, Dòrnait. The fault was mine. I underestimated you. It won't happen again." His tone, though soft, was laden with a veiled promise, almost ritualistic, as if he were speaking not just for himself, but on behalf of the spirits of his lineage. With a gesture of his hand, he indicated a high chair, sculpted with Celtic symbols, interwoven knots, Christian crosses, serpents, and spirals. It was the Lord's chair. A privilege or a trap, she thought. She was about to refuse the seat, but the aromas rising from the freshly served dishes, rye bread, boiled beef, dissuaded her. It wasn't any better than the food in her cell, but at least it was warm. She sat with the dignity of a captive queen. They ate in silence, and though she tried to ignore it, Dòrnait could feel Aodhgall's gaze fixed on her, as if he wanted to read beyond her skin. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, along with the murmur of the wind that slipped through the cracks, bringing with it the salty smell of the sea, and the whisper of ancient names lost between the waves and the stones. It was he who broke the silence. "Have they treated you well?" She lifted her eyes and looked at him over the rim of her mug. His face held the severity of a warrior god, but the eyes, as blue as the sky over the Hebrides, didn't match the harshness. She noticed his cheek, where the marks of her nails still lingered, though nearly faded. It reassured her to see that she hadn't caused him lasting harm. Just fleeting. Locked away for 3 days in a room? I was rotting from boredom, she replied, and her voice sounded like a taut string vibrating in the dim light. Aodhgall frowned, annoyed. In Dunsagothan, we don't have time for dances or courtly music, he said, his disdain barely concealed. Dòrnait didn't miss the judgment in his words. He saw her as a salon doll, useless for the hardships of the Highlands. But she dared to look at him again. I wasn't asking for that. The women of the Highlands don't sit and stare at the wall, do they? The answer took him by surprise. He leaned back, thoughtful. No, they don't. That gesture, that admission, was a crack through which something more human filtered through. Dòrnait decided to seize it. Have you written to my brother? One dark eyebrow arched, like that of a suspicious crow. You want to leave already? But you've only just arrived. Have you? She insisted, not letting herself be diverted. A messenger left for Rùm the day after we arrived. And has Terbert agreed to your demands? Not yet. And he won't. We'll see about that. Dòrnait felt a chill. Something grim lurked behind his confidence. Then a question struck her like lightning. What will you do with me if he doesn't agree? Aodhgall held her gaze. There was a terrible calm in his eyes, the calm of someone who has seen too much and still expects more. He will agree. And if not? He didn't answer immediately. The silence was long, like a starless night. Sooner or later, someone will notice your absence. But I think your escape has bought me some time. She furrowed her brow. How do you know that? I don't think you left Holyrood without explaining anything. You must have left messages. To talk about your brother. To distract. She paled. She had left notes for Ferchar and for her cousin Aodhgall. But how could he know? Aodhgall's gaze was unreadable. Then without warning, he asked, Why have you never married? Dòrnait stiffened, like a string about to snap. That's none of your concern. He looked her over, and though his next words seemed like a compliment, his tone was one of someone appraising an object. You're more than pleasant to look at. She held back a sneer of contempt. That was all anyone ever saw, the facade, the body, the dowry. No one saw the soul. No one seemed to want to. And what could marriage offer me that I don't already have? Aodhgall thought of the obvious, but held back. His desire for her was as ancient as fire, but he knew he had to wait. Her beauty, more than physical, had an almost enchanted quality. It was as if a banshee had taken flesh, or a rebellious saint had escaped from stained glass windows. Finally, he answered, You're not seeking wealth. Nor alliances. He shrugged. Maybe love, though that sounds like druid tales. Love isn't practical. One could wait an entire lifetime, if it ever comes, she said, with a hint of nostalgia that surprised him. He had never allowed himself to confuse desire with love. His duty was to his people. But with her, the line was thinner than he admitted. And what about passion? He asked, not breaking eye contact. She blushed, but her voice didn't falter. I don't think one requires the other. Aodhgall felt a surge of dark jealousy, like an ancient demon whispering in his ear. Had she been with another? That young man from Holyrood, perhaps? The thought seared him. What do you mean? That passion can be experienced outside of marriage. Often within it, there's none. He nodded, though it pained him to hear it come from her mouth. For a woman of your lineage, the marriage bed is the only respectable place to have it. She shot him a glare. I don't need sermons. Not from someone who kidnaps women. Aodhgall leaned toward her. His voice was barely a whisper. And you, Dòrnait, are you respectable? Her eyes burned. How dare you? He struggled to control his anger. He wanted to tear the truth from her, not out of curiosity but out of necessity. But he limited himself to drinking. It wasn't the time. He stood, ready to end the conversation. Then she spoke, her voice unexpectedly soft. Protection. Aodhgall stopped. That word rang like a bell in a stormy night. It wasn't a plea. It was a truth. And he, warrior of clans, son of the ancients, finally understood that between them, there wasn't only the spark of desire, but something older and more powerful, the struggle to find a safe place in a world that only understood power. Chapter 5. He moved the chair with a screech that broke against the stone like a held-back lament, and prepared to stand. Protection. Her voice was as immediate as a wave crashing against rock. He grabbed her wrist before she could rise. His fingers wrapped around her bare skin with the involuntary reverence one shows to something sacred, something that doesn't quite belong to this world. That brief touch revealed an unexpected truth. Although tall for a woman and proud of her curvaceous figure, Dòrnait was as fragile as the rowan branches, sacred to the ancients for their deceptive delicacy. Beneath her untamed spirit, and the haughtiness she wore like armor, lay a small, ethereal frame, as if woven from the mist of the hills. A woman alone, he said without letting go, especially one rich and with lands, is easy prey without a husband to protect her. I don't need. She stopped. Because the fortress where they stood, dark as a softly spoken psalm, was living proof of her contradiction. Her chin lifted like a spear against the affront. My mother protected me. But your mother is no longer here. The words, spoken with the raw dryness of winter, hit her like a knife. She shuddered, not from cold but from the truth. Dòrnait turned her face to him, and in her eyes was a scream she could not voice. An ancient ancestral scream, like those heard in the burial mounds under a full moon. Aodhgall felt the urge to take her in his arms with an almost supernatural force, but he stifled it. Compassion was a poison disguised as sweetness. He could not afford to drink it. And yet he saw it, the reflection of a loneliness as vast as the snow-covered highlands, one that no title or lineage could ease. Despite your reasons against it, he murmured, weighing his words, you have already admitted marriage has its advantages. What do you mean? Have you forgotten you were engaged? Color rose violently in her face. Of course not. But her earlier silence had betrayed her. Was it for protection or love, Dòrnait? He asked, his voice dropping to a tone as grave as a funeral psalm. Because the answer mattered. More than he cared to admit. There was a third possibility, the most dangerous of all, passion. She looked away. Lord Finlach was the one I had chosen. The same phrase, repeated like a defensive spell. But Aodhgall was beginning to glimpse the hidden landscape behind her actions. The escape had not been whim but protest. A silent rebellion against the imposition of a predetermined fate. Fjord would never force you to marry, he said. And there lay the heart of the dilemma. Fjord needed her consent, as he himself did. No alliance sealed without will survived the winters. She curled her lips in a bitter smile. Do you know my brother that well? Enough. He's told me about you. That confession, simple as a drop of water, seemed to sink deep into Dòrnait. The hunger in her eyes was ancient, and he understood, it was not for food or shelter but the longing to not be forgotten. Really? She lowered her gaze, distracted by her plate. But he had already seen what he needed to see. Had her family cast her aside like an uncomfortable relic? Of course. You're his sister. He cares for you. The words, soft as a gesture in the shadows, ignited something in her. Something he should not touch, but it was too late. The danger was not her. It was the humanity awakening in him as he looked at her. Perhaps Fjord wouldn't force me, she replied, but my cousin would. Aodhgall. The name slid through his mind like a shadow over the hills. Aodhgall didn't react, though he understood the fear. Even if Fjord had the final word, they were all bound to the same yoke, vassals of Aodhgall. And that gave the Earl more power than many wanted to admit. Your cousin has a habit of meddling where he's not wanted. And I have seen the scars that kind of meddling leaves. If I marry, it will be by my choice. Not my brother's nor my cousin's but mine. Her voice was that of someone fighting centuries of tradition. And Aodhgall understood she did not fear marriage. She feared losing her freedom. That escape had not been madness but a cry. He put his theory to the test. But a woman has no right to make such decisions. Whether you like it or not, your husband's choice is not yours. The blow was not physical, but she recoiled as if it were. The irony was cruel. Because in truth, she had more power than she imagined. But for now, it was better she didn't know. So a woman's fate is to be sold to the highest bidder. Said aloud, it sounded brutal. But often the truth is. It is. Well then I refuse. There was a steely gleam in her eyes. It was not childish stubbornness but resolution, tempered by suffering. He had to be careful. Time was his enemy, and she would not be won by force or pity. He knew well where her anger came from. Aodhgall Cambrach had also been a pawn disguised as a princess, married 4 times, allied to powerful men but haunted by unhappiness. And her daughter had inherited the memory of that disappointment. Your mother was wrong to put those ideas in your head. You know nothing of my mother, she whispered, bringing her hand to a brooch hidden in the folds of her bodice. Aodhgall froze when he saw it. His pulse quickened, as if time had ceased to flow normally. Where did you get that? She tried to hide it, but he had already recognized it. He took it reverently, a brooch surrounded by crossed axes and thistles engraved in silver, ancient symbols of the MacCraith bloodline. In the center, a smoky quartz stone, the stone of Highland chiefs. He turned the amulet over and read the inscription, barely visible after all these years. To my beloved husband, on our wedding day. A shiver ran down his spine. An irony so perfect he could almost laugh. Marrying Dòrnait MacCuinn was not only political. It was something more. Something that defied time. The curse. 80 years of pain. 80 years of shadows. And now her. The Cambrach girl. Holding the brooch between his fingers, he looked her straight in the eyes. There was no doubt. It's you. You are the Cambrach girl. Dòrnait cursed herself silently. Stupid. She should have hidden the amulet better, much better. How could she have imagined he would recognize it so easily? But of course, he was a MacCraith. To him, that jewel wasn't just another piece of ancient craftsmanship. It was history. It was a wound. It was a sentence. The legend lived in his blood. The chief who had chained Tuathla Cambrach to the sacrificial rock was one of his ancestors, perhaps his great-grandfather's grandfather, a figure wrapped in the mist of bardic songs. How could she forget that one of the reasons her mother had been forced into that first marriage was precisely to try to break that curse that had dragged like a shadow through generations? Surely you don't believe in that old tale, she asked, barely hiding her disdain. No, he answered without hesitation. Her relief lasted barely a blink. But many around here do, he added. His voice was grave, as if sharing a secret with the spirits still wandering the castle battlements. And he was right. In those lands where stories mingled with fog and psalms with the whispers of druids, superstitions were as stubborn as April frost. Ridiculous, she insisted, trying to cling to reason like a shield. My mother's marriage to Terbert's father should have ended all those old foolishness. Instead it fueled them, said Aodhgall, with a half-smile that seemed to know too much. And so it had been. For a brief time during that union fortune smiled on the MacCraith. The harvests prospered. The winds didn't tear roofs down. The swords found no flesh in battle. But death returned, and with it misfortunes multiplied. As if the curse hadn't been broken, only lulled to sleep. What had Dòrnait done by showing him the brooch? Had she ignited in Aodhgall the temptation to try again? Was she once more at the center of a ritual decided by others? "It doesn't matter," she finally said, lifting her chin. "The amulet belongs to me, and I will not give it up willingly." To you, she thought, but didn't say. She knew what the stories said. The spell would break only when a Cambrach woman gave that brooch willingly to a MacCraith. But her mother had never done so. She had carried it as a burden, like an ancient silver chain, but never offered it. Something sparked in Aodhgall's eyes, not greed but challenge. His steps brought him closer. The air between them grew thick, warm, charged with something invisible. It invaded the space she had kept as a shield, and wrapped around her. It was too big, too real. It had that scent that belonged neither to nobility nor peasants, but to legendary warriors, myrtle, soap, and something older. Oak smoke, perhaps? Ritual ash. Dòrnait felt her pulse racing. He was dangerously close. His lips barely a breath from hers. The shadow of his beard carved his jaw as if the chisel of a Celtic god had patiently sculpted it. Even his eyelashes, long as a fawn's, contrasted with the severity of his face. Aodhgall raised a hand, and for a moment she thought he would kiss her. That he would catch her like a storm catches sailors. But no. He only slowly brushed a lock of hair tangled in her lashes aside. With his fingertips he tucked it behind her ear, and there the light touch was enough to set her skin on fire. Dòrnait tensed. Her stomach clenched as if gripped from within by an invisible hand. How was it possible that this man could provoke so much with so little? He held her gaze, with the fierce calm of a hunter who has found the exact point where his prey stops running. Then his thumb barely brushed her cheek. A caress. A warning. "Are you completely sure?" he whispered, as if he wasn't only referring to the amulet, but to everything she was, what she felt, what she still didn't dare name. Yes, she stammered. She couldn't think. She didn't even know if she was still breathing. He noticed. And he laughed. Not with mockery, but with that dangerous superiority men have when they already know what's coming. He let go of her. "We'll see." Her cheeks burned as if he had struck them. With anger. With humiliation. With desire. "Do I need to protect myself from you, my lord?" He looked her up and down, as if assessing the flames of a fire. "Maybe," he said slowly, letting the words fall like stones into a well. "But you promised me," Dòrnait said, with barely veiled reproach. He seemed indifferent, like a laird listening to the pleas of the wind. "That's true. You have no honor." An eyebrow rose, proud and dangerously amused. "That's obvious," he replied, and let the dagger sink in. "Or you wouldn't be here." "A prisoner," she said, her soul torn to shreds. "Whether you're a prisoner or a guest depends on you," he replied, narrowing his eyes with the calm of one who can wait. "If you don't disobey me, your stay will be pleasant." There it was again, the wall. Not of stone but of will. And Dòrnait, who had been born to run among ferns and stars, stood tall like a wounded cat. "And what am I supposed to do while I'm your guest?" she asked, her voice laced with the elegant venom of sarcasm. "Whatever it is women do to keep themselves busy," he said with a shrug. "Do as you please, as long as you don't try to leave the walls of this fortress." She turned her back to him, to hide the smile tugging at her lips. But her thoughts were molten fire. In her mind, plans, tricks, and possibilities were already beginning to dance. Aodhgall MacCraith had kidnapped the wrong woman. And Dòrnait Cambrach would make him regret it. Without a doubt. Chapter 6. The living whisper of Gaia. The earth is not soil nor stone. It is consciousness. It is living memory. Where the clans shed blood, where ancestors whispered pacts between waves and roots, the earth still remembers. It keeps in its ancient cracks the names no one utters anymore, and the vows made under stormy skies. Those who walk without listening believe it is mute. But those who stop, those who fall silent to hear beyond the noise of ego can feel it. In the whisper of the wind, in the faint tremble of flowers, in the distant call of the crows, Gaia speaks. She has seen empires rise and fall. She has felt the wound of iron, and the tenderness of those who honor her spirit. And yet she waits. Because Gaia is not just origin. She is destiny. She is the mirror where every soul comes to remember who it has been, and who it can still become. In her beat the myths not as dead stories, but as living seeds waiting for the human heart to awaken them. What if the curse weighing on the MacCraith was not a punishment, but a call from the earth to remember the lost balance? Are you sure he won't be angry, Dòrnait? Roisel's voice rose just above the murmur of the wind slipping through the cracks in the wall, carrying the salty scent of the sea, and the whisper of the beaches lining the cliffs. Dòrnait didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at the overcast sky, where clouds heavy and gray as lead drifted over the coast of Aodhgall like cloaks of ancient sleeping gods. I certainly hope he gets angry, she thought with a suppressed smile. The MacCraith sisters, Roisel and Uranie, watched her with that mix of admiration and alarm only young souls can hold toward someone who breaks the rules so naturally. Only a few days ago, she had caught them lurking between the tapestries and stone corridors of the castle, spying on her movements with blatant curiosity. Instead of scolding them, Dòrnait had pretended to ignore them, which, as any rebellious spirit knew, only sharpened their appetite for mystery. Soon both girls had joined her, turned into accomplices out of sheer boredom. And it was no wonder. The castle of Dunsagathon, isolated among steep crags and shrouded in mists that seemed like breath of the ancients, was a place as beautiful as it was somber. There, where walls breathed history and echoes of forgotten prayers still roamed the ruined chapels, the girls lived under strict rules and repeated days, waiting for anything to disrupt the routine. Roisel, 17 years old with those unusually light eyes and dark chestnut hair, was as sensible as she was sweet, though with a streak of nostalgia that made her seem older. Uranie, by contrast, seemed born of fire and foam, red-haired, skin like ivory set ablaze by dawn, and an energy barely contained in her small body. Dòrnait recognized herself in her immediately. I'm just keeping busy, she said with feigned innocence. Your brother ordered me not to be idle. He also forbade you from entering the kitchen and the cellar, Roisel reminded her gently. Dòrnait shrugged with resigned air. I was only trying to help. Help? Uranie exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with mischief. By putting salt in the porridge and sugar in the beer. The laugh that burst from Dòrnait was like irreverent tinkling bells among the stone walls. She remembered that morning perfectly. It had been her first challenge, after the conversation in the tower. Her hands trembled as she stirred the stew she had altered with an innocent expression. But her gaze didn't waver when Aodhgall tasted the first spoonful, and holding back threw her a look as burning as a vow. He didn't scold her. He didn't give her the satisfaction of losing control. I thought they needed a little salt, Dòrnait protested then teasingly. I don't have much experience in the kitchen. At least not since Aodhgall banished me from his for similar reasons. He didn't let you help in the laundry or with mending clothes either, Roisel chimed in, though with a hint of a smile. His shirt smelled wonderful after my help, Dòrnait replied, pushing the irony to the limit. You mean like rosewater, laughed Uranie. And embroidered with pink flowers, but with the sleeves sewn inside out. That was an artistic touch, she answered. Though I admit shortening his trousers might have been too much. She didn't mention the nettles she had used to air out his favorite tartan. Just remembering his curses in Gaelic made every sting endured among the courtyard stones worthwhile. And yet he never lost his composure. His calmness, his way of holding back with patience tempered like the swords hanging in the armory, both exasperated and fascinated her equally. As if, instead of falling into her traps, he simply waited. Watched. Calculated. And that only deepened her desire to unsettle him. My brother is very particular about his weapons, Roisel said in a warning tone. Then he'll like to see them shining, Dòrnait replied, picking up a jar of oil with a smile that hid more than it showed. He has squires for that, insisted Roisial. But he doesn't have another Dòrnait MacCuinn, murmured Uranie more to herself than the others. The words hung in the air like a prophecy. Dòrnait didn't answer, though her gaze lingered briefly on Uranie. That little one could see more than she seemed. Don't you think what I did was right? Dòrnait asked, turning to Uranie with sudden seriousness. Uranie blushed, caught between loyalty and doubt. I don't know, she said. He has his reasons. Dòrnait nodded silently. She didn't want to turn the girls against her brother. It was clear they adored him. He, for his part, tried to protect them with the solemn clumsiness of a man who's forgotten how to be a brother, and plays at being a father. She knew him well. She had also grown up surrounded by men who loved her, but didn't know how to show it. Who's coming with me? She asked, breaking the moment. Me, said Uranie, raising her hand as if accepting a challenge. Are you sure you're only going to oil his swords? Roisial doubted. Absolutely sure, said Dòrnait, omitting the detail of the scented oil. Roisial still hesitated. Then Dòrnait smiled mischievously. You don't even have to go in. Just watch out in case Odin comes near. A blush lit Roisil's cheeks. His name is Coannich. I know. But you have to admit he looks like a war god. Tall, serious, with that gaze that seems ripped from a penitential psalm. He always scared me, Uranie said naturally. That's because you don't know him, Roisial whispered. He's actually very sweet. Dòrnait burst out laughing. God forbid your brother hears that. I don't think he'd like one of his fiercest warriors described as a candy. Roisial turned pale. You won't tell him. Don't be silly. I was only joking. And taking her hand gently, Dòrnait added, stay here. Uranie and I will be back before you can cross yourself. Roisial hesitated, then shook her head. No. I'm coming with you. Dòrnait smiled, and with a gesture imitating a heroine from the old Gaelic ballads declared. Very well. To the armory, ladies. May the gods, Christian or Druid, protect us from what we're about to do. The oil of St. Kilda. The stone walls of Dunbray, tinged grey by the morning mist, seemed to breathe with a slow, deep pulse. The sun, shy behind a veil of clouds, barely managed to pierce the damp atmosphere that enveloped the fortress. From the western tower one could see the heather-covered hills, where the echoes of ancient gods still whispered among hawthorn bushes and forgotten burial mounds. Aodhgall walked with the restrained pace of a man on the edge of fury. Beneath his boots, the barmkin's cobblestones creaked as if sensing the weight of his thoughts. He had trained himself to exhaustion, but neither the edge of his claymore nor the rigor of combat could calm the storm inside him. It wasn't steel or duty that unsettled him, but the impish, provocative creature who had shattered the stillness of his castle like a mischievous spirit from Beltane tales. Dòrnait MacCuinn. A name that tasted like a storm. In less than a week she had become his penance, his temptation and his punishment. He thought with bitter irony that he had mistaken her curiosity about the castle for a sign of acceptance. Foolish. Every blue glance she cast his way seemed to strip away his defenses, as if some ancient witch had cast a spell on him. It wasn't just desire that consumed him, though desire burned in him like the Beltane fire lit atop the hills. It was something deeper, more dangerous. Something that made him vulnerable. And Aodhgall was no man used to showing weakness. Finding her neither in her chambers nor in the hall, he headed to the armory. In the courtyard, he saw his sister Roisial speaking with Coannich, his captain. A smile, a blush. Roisil's eyes sparkled with a hope that felt alien to that cold stone place. A pang of remorse hit him. His sisters deserved more than gloomy castles and imposed duties. But his attention shifted when he saw the half-open door of the armory. A dark, certain premonition tightened his chest. He pushed the oak door, and a nearly infernal stench hit him like an Atlantic wave. Fulmer. The oil of the bird from St. Kilda, brought from the most remote cliffs of their lands, filled the air with its salty, fetid odor. There was no doubt who was behind this. Uranie ran toward him, with the innocent look of someone unaware of the reach of her mischief. "We wanted to surprise you." Aodhgall did not answer. His eyes settled on Dòrnait, who looked at him with an expression that was both defiant and amused, like a sylph aware of the chaos she left behind. On the ground his swords gleamed, soaked in that foul oil. Even the claymore, his companion of blood and steel, was defiled. He held back the fury roaring inside him like a chained beast. "Uranie, go inside with Roisiel," his voice was low but firm. "I'll speak with Miss MacCuinn." When the door closed, the air seemed to tense like a bowstring. In a swift motion, he grabbed her by the arms and pulled her against his chest. She struggled but did not pull away. She was fire and ice, a rebellious and proud fairy who didn't know when to stop playing with shadows. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "I was just trying to help. You said I had to keep busy." He clenched his teeth, feeling his body vibrate beneath her touch. She was a constant provocation, a temptation wrapped in silk and audacity. And yet he couldn't touch her. Not the way he wanted. Not without losing what little control he had left. "If you provoke me, I might bite," he said in a low voice, his mouth brushing her temple, inhaling the scent of roses he still couldn't erase from his memory. She did not step back. "I don't know what you're talking about." She was lying, of course. And the slight tremor of her lip betrayed her. He could see her for what she was, not just a stubborn young woman, but a lonely, scared girl who had learned to survive in a world of masks and demands. With a controlled sigh, he released her. "You will clean every one of these swords. Until not a trace of oil remains." "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, blinking with false innocence. God. She was beautiful in an ancient, almost pagan way. Like the maidens of legends, who enchanted heroes and made them forget their mission. Her face had the purity of ivory, and eyes as blue as the sacred waters of the island wells. "Don't play with me, Dòrnait. I'm not one of your court knights. I'm not gentle. I wasn't raised to be." "Then what are you?" "I'm a chief," he replied harshly. "And as long as you're under my roof, you'll follow my rules. Your sisters are bored. Uranie should be studying, Roisiel should be dancing. This castle is not a convent." His words were like thorns. They hurt because they were true. Because they spoke what he himself had kept silent for years. "When I want your opinion, I'll ask for it." She glared at him. "Is that what you think of the court? That it corrupts? I've set foot there more times than you imagine. I found no more virtue there than here. It shows." Then he laughed. It was a low, rough sound, like a log cracking in the fire. For a moment, something opened between them. A brief, fragile space where silence seemed to hang on a note of strange intimacy. But Dòrnait, nerves raw, turned to hide the trembling of her fingers. She took off her leather gloves, one by one, as if doing so could protect her. "What did you want?" "You'll have dinner with me tonight." She looked at him, as if he had just summoned a ghost. "I prefer to eat alone." "I'm not asking." Then the tension exploded. He grabbed her, holding her with brutal urgency, his whole body roaring with the desire held back for weeks. She gasped, her eyes wide, but he didn't stop. He kissed her. Not gently, but with fierce need. It was a kiss of fire, a punishment, a plea. He wanted to possess her, devour her, show her who he was and what she made him feel. But as their mouths met and their breaths tangled, something changed. What began as an assault turned into tenderness. His thumb caressed the curve of her cheek. His tongue, no longer invasive, sought comfort and answer. And she gave it. With her arms around his neck, Dòrnait kissed him. Trembling, sweet. So innocent it broke something inside him. When they parted, their breaths were a shared echo. In the dimness of the armory, surrounded by the stench of fulmer and steel, a new kind of war had begun. More dangerous, more intimate. Because this one wasn't fought with swords but with exposed hearts. Chapter 7. Dunbray Castle at dusk. When Dòrnait crossed the threshold of her chamber, she could barely stand. The cold air of the corridor, still tinged with the smell of burnt peat, contrasted sharply with the warm steam inside her room. She closed the door behind her with numb hands, and leaned against it for a moment, exhausted. She had spent hours cleaning the sticky fulmer oil, so penetrating and rancid it seemed to have seeped into her very soul. If she hadn't feared him coming upstairs to drag her back to dinner with that granite and fire look, she would have excused herself without any remorse. She stripped off her dress, garment by garment, as if peeling away the remains of a day lived in someone else's skin. The apron had done little good. The wool of the dress still held traces of the oil, as if the seabird had marked her with its shadow. She sighed. The fault was hers, yes, but it had been worth it. Maybe Roisiel could lend her a piece of linen. Or maybe not. Perhaps keeping the stench was a shield, a reminder for him, a simple charm to keep him away. The bathtub waited near the hearth. The water steamed from stones boiled over the fire, scented with dry lavender sprigs gathered from the meadow beneath the hill of the ancients. The vapor floated in the room, softening the air, veiling the twilight's glow filtering through the narrow window. She slipped in with a trembling sigh, feeling the warmth pull the weariness from her bones like a slow, silent exorcism. But the heat also brought back what she wanted to leave behind. The kiss. She brought her fingers to her still sensitive lips, as if the memory was stitched there with burning thread. Had it really happened? Had she, daughter of the MacCuinn clan, dignified and proud, really melted in his arms like an offering on the altar of a pagan god? He had kissed her as if she were fragile, as if touching her might break her, yet he had awakened a flame in her that knew no bounds. Beneath his mouth she had felt protected, loved, desired. A gust of wind crossed the chimney, howling like a forest spirit. It tapped the water, scattering the dry leaves like pollen over an invisible current. What was the point of it all? She wasn't one to dream, much less to surrender. And yet? No, she corrected herself firmly. He wasn't a barbarian. Not entirely. There was a nobility in him that surprised her in small gestures, in the way he looked at her when he thought she didn't notice, in the way he hadn't pushed her when he could have. He was like a sacred rock of the old Celtic world, imposing, untamable, but with lichens of tenderness growing in his cracks. She sank completely, letting the water cover her hair and face. She wished it would also cover her memory, wash away the heat of his mouth. But the taste of that kiss, salty like the sea, warm like the fire of Beltane, did not fade. It wouldn't fade. She surfaced with a gasp, wrapped in silence and steam. She told herself once more it had been a mistake. That it wouldn't happen again. That she was his prisoner, a pawn in a game of lineage and power. She couldn't afford to forget that. She couldn't let herself be carried away by feelings that weren't hers. Dòrnait knew her own worth. She was not a trophy to fulfill a prophecy or heal a clan's wound. She was a woman, and she would accept nothing less than to be chosen freely by a man who saw her as an equal. She stood, water trickling over her skin like liquid crystals. She wrapped herself in a rough towel, trying to calm the tremor that was not entirely from cold. Where was Celia's? She had promised to come back to light the fire and brush her hair. Dòrnait walked to the window. The sun was sinking beyond the lake, tinting the waters a golden amber, like the light through a stained glass window in an abandoned church. Then a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she said without turning, certain it was Celia's. But the silence that followed was not that of an old maid. It was thicker, more electric. She felt the presence before seeing it. She turned slowly and the world stopped. Aodhgall MacCraith stood in the doorway. Still as a basalt statue, his face half in shadow, his eyes burning with an intensity that took her breath away. Dòrnait stepped back. For the first time in her life she felt truly naked. Vulnerable. Not out of fear of harm, but because of the raw intimacy crackling between them like a sacred fire. The cloth covering her was so thin it barely hid her wet body. Every curve, every hollow, every trace of her skin was exposed beneath the damp fabric like a forbidden vision. And he looked at her like a thirsty man before the god's spring. Her hair was damp, tousled by the wind. The stubble traced shadows over the firmness of his jaw. The scars, marks of war and legend, emphasized his virility. The tartan draped over his shoulder, fastened with a silver brooch, made him look like a warrior from another era, risen from a Celtic dream. But Dòrnait only thought of his lips. The warmth of his mouth. How a single brush had made her tremble. A shiver ran down her spine. "God, you are beautiful," he murmured hoarse. It was more a prayer than a compliment. It wasn't the words. It was the way he said them. As if he truly saw her. Not just with desire, but with awe. With hunger. The muscles in his jaw tensed. He was holding himself back, she knew. And that unsettled her more than anything else. No man had ever looked at her like that, as if she were the only thing between heaven and earth. As if he could break the spell and get lost forever. Dòrnait wanted to order him out. She wanted to scream. But the words tangled in her throat, as if the steam from the bath had dissolved them. "Get out of here," she finally managed to say, her voice broken and trembling. "You shouldn't be here. This is my room. My sanctuary," she thought. And he was defiling it with the same reverence one treads a sacred place. Leaving her without refuge. "You have to leave. Now." The twilight light cast their shadows on the wall. Two figures trapped in a moment that belonged to no time, like a tale from the ancient bards. And the silence, thick as a spell, sealed the scene. The room still smelled of lavender warmed by the bath steam, and the distant crackle of fires in the castle's halls echoed the very beating of Aodhgall's heart. Outside, the night over Dun Sagothan spread like a velvet blue cloak over the hills, where the sea wind carried the old prayers of Christian monks and the whispers of druids sleeping in the earth. Inside, the heat of desire lingered, suffocating as poorly extinguished incense. Aodhgall had thought he knew temptation. He had fought for his clan, survived hunger, snow, betrayals, but nothing had prepared him for the moment when Dòrnait's wet curls slipped down her back like threads of liquid gold. The body revealed to him was not just beauty, it was power, it was enchantment. Every curve, every shadow on her skin spoke not of mere desire, but of an ancient Celtic curse that bound men to the will of women touched by the sacred. And Dòrnait. Dòrnait seemed to have come from a vision of Brigid, with her ivory skin and that trembling shiver, as if the water had not quite left her. The air was as heavy with desire as the forest near Beltane, moist and alive with omens. "Please," she whispered, barely a breath. The man he was, forged in the harshness of the highlands, should have stepped back then. But the fire did not relent. Still he retreated. Not out of fear. Not out of weakness. But because he knew Dòrnait's soul was not one to be taken without destroying it. And that shook him more than the urge to possess her. Only then, breaking the spell, did he drop the box at his feet. The echo was louder than necessary, as if a bell reminded him to return to the earthly. "It's for tonight," he said in a voice that was not his own, hoarse, almost rough. "I thought you might want it." The flickering candlelight reflected the surprise in Dòrnait's eyes. Pride, as alive in her as blood, seemed to yield for a moment to something softer. Her fingers brushed the brocade with a tenderness that disarmed what remained of her resolve. "Thank you," she said, without needing to say more. He nodded brusquely and fled. He left before succumbing to the certainty that pulsed deep within him. If he stayed even a minute longer, their fate would be sealed in that chamber before dawn arrived. Hours later, in the great hall, Aodhgall sat among his own, but he was distant. The music of the bagpipes echoed through the ancient stones, and the flames of the torches danced with the echoes of the old Gaelic. But in his chest, restlessness beat like a war drum. Dòrnait had not appeared. The beer did not soothe him. The banquet, splendid in its simplicity, did not quell his hunger. And it was not hunger for food. It was a different kind of emptiness, one that only grew the more he thought of her. He seemed to see her in every silhouette, hear her in every laugh. And it was nothing but his mind feeding the fever. Then there was silence. Not the ordinary kind, but that which precedes revelations, omens. Everyone turned. And there she was. Dòrnait MacCuinn. Dressed like a queen exiled from another time. As if Anya herself, the goddess of the sun and desire, had descended upon the stone castle to remind everyone of what true nobility was. Her gown shone as if it contained the gold of Solomon's temple. Her pearls seemed like tears from the sirens of Staffa. There was something impossible about her, something as exquisitely out of place as a rose blooming atop Ben Nevis in the heart of winter. Aodhgall felt a lump in his throat, not just from desire, but from what she represented. Dòrnait did not belong to his world, not to the shadows of the rain-battered castle, not to the clan living between the sword and the earth. She was light. She was court. She was everything he had fought and despised, but now in her it seemed to have a new meaning. And yet when their eyes met, something trembled. An invisible vibration, like the string of a Celtic harp. The memory of her wet skin, her ragged breath, that sacred moment by the window wrapped around them. She remembered too. Blush. Subtlety. A silent confession. He stood. Not to claim her. Not yet. But to offer her a place beside him, as a druid would offer their circle to a deity about to reveal itself. Destiny is not forged with the sword, he thought. It is forged in the slow-burning fire. And Aodhgall knew, as she sat beside him with the calm of one who accepts their role in a much older story, that the battle had only just begun. Chapter 8. Under the stone arches of the great hall, the torches flickered like dancing stars, casting shifting shadows on the walls adorned with ancient tapestries. The embroidered figures, Christian saints, Celtic knots, otherworldly beasts, seemed to watch the scene with ancestral eyes. The smell of wax, damp peat, and roasted meat hung in the air, dense like the fog that sometimes crept in from the Atlantic to the castle corridors. The crackling of the fire in the hearth was like the murmur of time passing, an eternal witness to secrets, betrayals, and budding loves. Uranie, sitting beside Dòrnait on the other side of the table, was the first to break the spell of silence that had briefly formed between them. "You look beautiful, Dòrnait," she said, her voice low, trembling like a note poorly held in a harp song. Aodhgall felt those words cut through him. Not because of Dòrnait's beauty, but because of what they revealed in his sister, a quiet longing, a nostalgia for something she could never have. Dòrnait, wrapped in that dress like a goddess of the city tombs, embodied a splendor he could not offer the women of his blood. Not without stealing or asking for something that could not be given. "Thank you, Uranie," Dòrnait replied, throwing him a fleeting glance as if expecting more than just courtesy. Aodhgall held her gaze with the intensity of one trying to read an omen. "We've been waiting for you." A blush tinted her cheeks, as if the comment had been a disguised reproach. "I've come as quickly as I could. Cilias doesn't know how to handle these dresses, and normally I have 2 maids to help me." She hurried to clarify. "It's not a complaint, just a fact. Putting on one of these dresses requires a bit of strategy." He observed her now with a different attention. The slight furrow of her brow creased her forehead, and he felt a sharp, unexpected tenderness. He wished, without knowing why, to smooth those wrinkles with his thumb. But he didn't. His hand, weathered by swords and sea wind, wasn't made to touch beauty without leaving a mark. "I see," he murmured. "Perhaps I shouldn't have worn it. The dress you gave me when I arrived would have been more appropriate." He felt her shrink slightly, as if afraid of his judgment. That struck him like a cold gust of wind from the sea. This woman so full of light was holding back for him. When had he become this ruthless? "You're fine as you are," he replied, more abruptly than he intended. Her eyes lit up with mischief. "Well, that almost sounded like a compliment. If you keep being so eloquent, you'll make the bards die of jealousy." A brief but genuine smile curved his lips. She was quick with her tongue, the girl. Like the old witches in tales, who knew how to weave words that both burned and healed. "I'll keep that in mind." She smiled back at him, and something shifted in the air between them, a subtle current running beneath the surface of their words. Dòrnait turned, scanning the table with her gaze. "Where is Roisiel?" The smile faded from Aodhgall's face. She wasn't feeling well. She preferred to dine in her room. He pursed his lips in concern, as though the name of the young woman evoked an unsettled debt. Dòrnait placed her hands on the table, about to stand. "Is she ill? Should I go see her?" Before he could stop himself, his hand found hers. He felt its warmth, small, strangely fragile. That gesture, almost automatic, held an unexpected depth, protection, control, and something more primitive. Something he didn't fully understand himself. "She'll be fine," he said firmly. "She'll be better by tomorrow." He hoped so. Though the memory of Roisel's face, pale and covered in tears, still haunted him like an unconfessed guilt. Dòrnait looked at their hands on the table, with a gaze that seemed to search for something. Did she also feel that hidden current, that invisible thread vibrating between them? "That reminds me," she murmured, lifting her eyes to him. "Who is Fionnan?" The tension stiffened his shoulders, but he composed himself quickly. He withdrew his hand. "My younger brother." "I thought so. I heard his name on the stairs. But when I asked, no one would tell me anything. Why haven't you introduced me?" "He's not here." "Will he be back soon?" "Yes," he replied, without adding what he truly thought. "He'll return when you can no longer change the inevitable." He raised his hand to begin the feast, breaking the conversation as if cutting a taut string. The dishes began to arrive amidst cheers and laughter: salted meat, oatmeal bread, cabbage boiled with butter. A feast he could barely afford, but had offered like a sacrifice to the ancient gods for their favor. He watched Dòrnait as she laughed with Coanich and Urani, with a naturalness he never associated with nobility. Was she enjoying herself? Or was it all a facade, like the splendor of the courts? He turned toward her when the laughter quieted, and asked, "Are you happy you came tonight?" She looked at him with that gaze that seemed to pierce into his chest. Throughout the entire dinner, he had felt her presence like a flame close to his skin. He couldn't explain the effect this man had on her. His appearance was rough, his gestures measured, his face as hard as stone battered by storms, and yet something about him spoke to a part of her she didn't know existed. While she considered her response, the hall continued to hum with life. The bagpipes sent notes soaring like gulls' cries on the coast. The Ceannfhionn told stories of saints speaking with deer and kings making pacts with fairies, and the warriors danced on crossed swords as if stepping on the very edge of the world. It was an atmosphere filled with sacred, ancient echoes, where the boundaries between the human and the divine seemed to blur. And then she remembered the young warrior who had wept for his son. Aodhgall himself had received news of the child, amidst the chaos of the rescues. That, more than any gallantry, revealed the soul of the man beside her. "If you're asking whether I'm happy you forced me to come," she said with a half-smile, "the answer is no. But your pipers are marvelous, and the dancing is impressive. So yes, I'm having fun." He didn't respond immediately, but a nearly imperceptible expression flickered across his face. Like a warrior who receives a minor wound, and chooses not to stop. Then she leaned in, as if she wanted to share a secret. "You know," she whispered, "you could attract more bees if you used honey." He looked at her with that gleam that only comes when a man feels the edge of a desire he can't quite name yet. His eyes slid down to the neckline of her dress, where the fabric barely contained the soft hills of her breasts. A dense, intimate tension stirred between them. "What kind of honey are you referring to, Dòrnait?" he asked, his voice so low it seemed to rise from the center of the earth. she felt a shiver run up her spine like a breath from the other world. A spark between desire and danger. Any kind that isn't disguised as order. The wind from the west, laden with salt and legend, whistled between the towers of Dunsagathon, brushing the battlements like an old druid whispering secrets into the ears of stones. Inside the hall, barely lit by the flickering light of torches set into the granite walls, the air smelled of wax, iron, and peat smoke. Beyond the window, the sea struck the rocks with an ancient rhythm, as if answering the old conflict that still lived in those lands. Aodhgall turned his face toward the window, which had no glass, where the night fell with an almost religious solemnity. His eyes, gray like the fog over the Hebrides, remained fixed on the horizon. A muscle twitched in his jaw, revealing the inner battle that even his self-control could not conceal. "I did," he repeated in a low, almost sepulchral voice. His Majesty was informed, through his counselors. Men with smooth tongues and withered hearts, who have never set foot on these lands or heard of the Brian laws, or of blood oaths, or the ancient curses still sleeping in the roots of our oaks. Dòrnait watched him with a mix of fear and fascination. In that moment she understood that within Aodhgall, the chief and the man coexisted, the warrior shaped by blood, and the son of a lineage as old as the stones. He was a tragic and living figure, like a Celtic carving of a forgotten god, his forehead marked by the weight of generations watching him from the other world. "And what did they say?" she asked softly. Aodhgall let out a bitter laugh, devoid of any joy. "They offered me a title without lands, and a sum of money in exchange for my silence. They think they can buy the honor of a MacCraith, as they buy a head of cattle in Stirling." A heavy silence settled between them. The fire in the hearth crackled loudly, as if the flames had something to say. Behind the heat and the dancing shadows, Dòrnait felt the presence of the castle itself, as if the stones were listening, holding in their cracks the memory of the lineage, the broken oaths, and the souls of the fallen. "So you brought me here because the king didn't help you," she said, her voice trembling as if walking on thin ice. "And can I help?" He looked at her again. There was no cruelty in his eyes, but there was a hardness of ancient granite. "Your surname can open doors. Your blood," he hesitated for a moment, "your blood is both key and sword. Terbert might listen to you. You could persuade him to retreat, to settle for what he has already taken." Dòrnait straightened. Her face, until then full of shadows, lit up with a mix of indignation and clarity. "Do you think I can change the heart of a man like Terbert? I hardly know him. And the little I know of him, you told me." "I don't want you to change his heart," he replied, his words piercing the shadows like arrows. "I just want you to speak in your mother's name. Terbert still honors her memory. You could remind him who she was, what she meant to her people." Dòrnait pressed her lips together. Her mother. It was like invoking the name of a fallen saint, an echo of mass in a ruined chapel. The idea overwhelmed her, like a whirlwind of emotions. What if she could do something? What if this war of blood, pride, and death could be bent with words alone? Silence enveloped them again. Outside, the sea continued to pound its song, and the hills of Rùm rose dark against the night sky, as if the very Kaya, the old goddess of winter, watched from the heights with her frost-covered staff. In some corner of the hall, a bard was singing an old Gaelic melody about divided clans, broken oaths, and doomed lovers. The song seemed made for them. Then Dòrnait spoke, her voice a whisper, but also a promise. "I will try." Aodhgall lowered his gaze to her. For a moment, the severity vanished from his face, and what appeared in its place was something more human, more vulnerable. Something close to gratitude, or perhaps to hope. "Thank you," he simply said. She lowered her eyes. She couldn't hold his gaze for long. Something about him disturbed her more than the conflict, more than the pride of the clans or the brutality of the past. He looked at her as if he knew her, as if he saw something in her that even she had not yet discovered. And though she didn't say it out loud, she knew deep inside that that gesture of help, that "I will try," had just sealed a fate deeper than any alliance oath. Chapter 9. On the threshold of the storm. The light of dawn slowly poured over Dunsagathon, as if the sun shy peered through the clouds to check if the earth was still worthy of its warmth. The castle rooftops shimmered with a damp sheen, and the garden on the south side awoke with a new vibration. The first buds of spring pushed through the sleeping roots, releasing a scent of fresh sap and ancient sea. Yet Aodhgall walked unaware of this beauty, his step firm and furrowed, disturbing the calm of the courtyard like a shadow denser than the others. The sea breeze, laden with salt and promises of rebirth, failed to dispel the burning pain in his chest since the night before. The land might bloom, but inside he was aflame. His dream had been a field of ghosts, the face of his brother Fionn behind the damp bars of blackness, the cold voice of King James, and Terbert's dry laugh echoing like the ravens that herald doom. The weight of every decision tightened his muscles. He knew that every step he took led him further from a simple resolution. He had been raised among legends that spoke of blood pacts, inviolable oaths, and condemned heroes. And now he himself walked that path, where every choice stained him. Ceannfhionn was among the hedges of the garden, her back to him, bent over a bed of wormwood and borage. The steam of her breath mixed with the morning dew. She didn't flinch when she heard the footsteps of the chief of Rùm, and it was that confidence, that offering of her body without demand, that confirmed to him that he was doing the right thing. When she turned, a smile of feline sweetness on her lips, Aodhgall felt that the gesture no longer sparked any fire within him. Not even a spark. "My lord," she said, her voice sounding coated in honey. "What a pleasant surprise." She approached with the studied grace of someone who knew their power, letting her hips speak the language of desire. When she stopped in front of him, her breasts barely brushed his chest, and her gaze, a mix of flirtation and calculation, rose, as if she already knew the answer. "Do you need anything?" "Not today, girl," he replied without softness. "And tonight?" Aodhgall shook his head. She let out an almost imperceptible "oh," as if it were a wisp of fog disappearing among the branches. He had been clear from the start, but the tears in Ceannfhionn's eyes were a silent plea. Even so, he couldn't offer her what he didn't have. His desire no longer belonged to him. Dòrnait had claimed it as the sea claims the shore, with patience, violence, and tenderness all at once. "I knew you would understand," he said in a grave voice. But she didn't understand. The gesture of tenderness he had shown, brushing a dark lock of hair from her forehead, became in Ceannfhionn's eyes confirmation. Love is blind, but hopelessness even more so. "It's because of her, isn't it?" Her voice turned bitter. "Yesterday, she looked at me as if she wanted to make me disappear. She asked you to make me leave." Aodhgall furrowed his brow. The malice on her face was not new, but its intensity was. "The decision was mine," he said dryly. "She'll never please you like I do. She's fragile." Innocent, Ceannfhionn slid her hand down his torso, but he didn't shudder. "I know what you like, my lord. And I know how to give you pleasure." The words, far from tempting him, churned his stomach. Not because they were false, but because they no longer spoke to him. He could possess her in an instant, unleash his fury on her eager mouth, but in his mind only the vision of Dòrnait's face existed, her lips slightly parted, the flush on her cheeks when he touched her for the first time. "Do you think your lady would allow the same?" Ceannfhionn tried to poison him with her mockery, but he had already stepped away. "It's none of your business," he said harshly. She looked at him with barely contained rage. "I thought there was something more between us. There was desire. That's all. And I was clear from the start. And her. Will she be your wife?" Aodhgall squinted. There shouldn't have been cracks in his wall, yet suspicion crept in like dampness between the stones of the castle. Who had spoken? "Don't interfere, Ceannfhionn," he said finally, with a gravity that left little room for hope. "Don't." Dunbray Castle seemed carved from silence as Dòrnait descended into the main hall. The stone breathed an ancient coldness, as if it still held within its depths the sighs of the monks who had once blessed these lands, or the echoes of druids who offered prayers to the gods of oak and river. I need you, darling. Don't mistake that. That whisper, the confession from the previous night, still hammered in her chest. But why did he need her? Was it love? Duty? Or something darker? She forced herself to eat breakfast, though the bread tasted like ash and the porridge like mud. The image of Roisiel, absent from the table, troubled her. Guilt crept inside her like water through a crack. But then, as she passed by a window, the world stopped. There he was, holding another woman. The same dark-haired woman who had watched her the night before. Their bodies spoke a language without the need for words. The woman's hand. God. Dòrnait quickly averted her gaze, her heart pounding wildly, and turned toward Uranie, still sitting at the table. Uranie, who was that woman looking at your brother last night? Uranie's knife fell to the floor with a clatter that contrasted with her hesitant voice. What woman? The one with the black hair. Very beautiful. Is she his fiancée? No, Uranie replied too quickly. My brother isn't engaged. Then is she his lover? Uranie didn't respond. There was no need. Dòrnait swallowed hard. She shouldn't be affected. She had no right. But the truth strikes where pride cannot defend. She pretended indifference. It doesn't matter, Uranie. You shouldn't have answered me at all. And she left the hall as if fleeing from the wind. In the darkness of the stairwell, Dòrnait leaned against the stone. The echo of her heartbeat surrounded her. She was on the verge of tears, and didn't understand why. He was her captor. Her enemy. But he was also the only man who had looked at her, as though he saw beyond her last name. As if she herself were part of something bigger. Something inevitable. She rubbed her face with her hands, suppressing the emotion that throbbed in her throat. She was being a fool. Yet a quiet inner whisper told her otherwise. She was beginning to love the wrong man. Chapter 10. Swords beneath the salt of the wind. The sun descended slowly behind the western cliffs, shredding fiery clouds over the choppy Atlantic. The restless waters battered the black rocks at the foot of Rùm Castle, as if the tides had awoken in ancient fury. The wind, scented with salt and heather, slipped through the battlements with an ancestral howl, carrying voices from the otherworld. It was a day that seemed torn from the Mabinogion, where men were more than men, and the gods still walked in the shadows of the earth. Dòrnait stood motionless, as if trapped by a spell. Her eyes couldn't leave the combat, the two warriors facing each other beneath the Celtic sky. It wasn't a training session. It was judgment. It was a challenge. It was a dance of fury and honor woven in steel. Aodhgall, with his bare sweat-covered torso, shone like an avatar of Lu, the god of just war and mastery. Each of his strikes was a sentence, each movement a litany of contained power. Coanich, the blonde captain, stood firm like an oak in the forest of Cernunnos, primal strength in his arms, the fierceness of the wounded lover in every thrust. Their swords spoke for them. Words long ago had shattered between their lips. A wave of anguish rose in Dòrnait's chest. She understood it all now. They were not just two men. They were two possible futures, facing death. The look Aodhgall had cast her way wasn't just a warning. It was a sentence sealed in the steel of his claymore. It wasn't her place, but it was her fault. A crash of steel reverberated between the towers of the castle. Coanich briefly fell to his knees, panting. Aodhgall didn't take advantage. He stepped back, allowing him to rise. It was a strange gesture amid all that fury, but deeply revealing. He didn't want to kill him. Not yet. The fight wasn't out of hatred. It was for possession, for the right to decide, for something beyond them, Roisiel. The clan. Duty. Blood. In that moment, a figure silently slipped through the side passage of the wall. Roisiel. The wind fluttered her dark hair like a mourning cloak, and her eyes, wet with unshed tears, seemed to guard the last of a Celtic saint's tears. Her face was tense but serene. The delicacy of her movements hid the resolve burning within her. "Stop," she cried, her voice breaking the air like thunder between the stones. The sound was more powerful than any clash of swords. Both men halted. The tension hung thick, like the dense fog of the swamps at Beltane. Roisiel walked between them, raising her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly, but not from fear. It was the trembling firmness of one who has made an irrevocable sacrifice. "This is not justice. This is not protection. This is pride," she said, looking at them both, her voice firm, tempered like Celtic iron immersed in sacred waters. "I will not allow you to destroy each other for my sake. It is not worth losing a brother or a lover in the name of the clan." The evening mist began to settle over the fields, enveloping the scene with a veil of the sacred. Dòrnait noticed that the soldiers around them had fallen into complete silence. The old druid who tended the castle's chapel was among them, murmuring a low prayer, as if he recognized that something sacred was unfolding. Roisiel, standing between the two men, was more than a sister or a lover. In that moment she embodied Brigid, goddess of spring and sacrifice, mediator between fire and earth, between war and healing. Aodhgall slowly lowered his sword. The twilight painted purple shadows on his cheekbones, making him seem like a statue sculpted by the tides. His gaze fell on Roisiel with a strange gleam, pride, frustration, and a painful tenderness. "I don't want to lose you," he said at last, as if the words were being torn from his chest. "I can't let you give your life away for a whim." Roisiel stepped forward and took the blade of his sword in her bare hands. A faint line of blood appeared, but she didn't pull back. Like the saintly martyrs of Christianity, she accepted the wound as proof of her word. "It's not a whim. It's love. And I don't want you to protect me from it. I want you to bless me for feeling it." A long silence followed her words. Dòrnait felt a cold current run down her back. It didn't come from the wind. It was something else. As if the castle itself, with its centuries of living memory, its stones soaked in ancient pacts, had held its breath. And then for a moment the voice of the earth spoke, and it became flesh in Aodhgall's gesture. He released the sword. It fell onto the wet grass, a silent witness to the duel. "So be it," he said in a hoarse voice, barely audible. "But may God and the ancient spirits protect you from what may come. Love is not weak. But it is vulnerable." Roisiel closed her eyes. A single tear slid down her cheek, not from sadness but from liberation. Dòrnait felt the air lighten, as if the invisible pressure had finally dissipated. But she didn't feel light. She wasn't finished. As Coinich approached Roisiel, and the soldiers began to disperse slowly, murmuring in low voices, Dòrnait remained still. Aodhgall was also watching her. In his eyes, there was no longer fury. But neither was there peace. What existed between them remained unresolved, like a knot beneath the skin that neither time nor words could untangle. And as the sun fully sank into the sea of the ancients, Dòrnait knew this was only the beginning. The hardest war had yet to be fought. The clash of battle faded, like the echo of thunder lost among the glens, silenced by the calm voice of Dòrnait. Around her, the men dispersed with the quiet obedience of deer beneath the shadow of a hawk. The afternoon sun fell obliquely across the stone walls of Dunbray Castle, lighting the golden lichens climbing its granite face, and casting a reverent stillness over the scene, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Aodhgall stood alone in the clearing, the pulse still pounding in his temples, his bare chest gleaming under the light like bronze forged by the ancient gods. He looked at Dòrnait with a mixture of awe and recognition. What the hell had just happened? He knew, of course he knew. He and Coinich, swept up in the whirlwind of unnamed emotions Roisiel had stirred in them, had crossed a line. And Dòrnait had brought him back. The maiden had touched him, and in that instant, it was as if the mist of a Celtic spell had lifted at the brush of a blessed hand. She had returned him to the light with the same power that, according to the monks of Iona, only the saints could summon. He glanced down at the hand she still held against his chest. It was small and pale, like that of a city from the hills of Tirnanog, and yet her touch had chilled his soul only to set it aflame. When she withdrew it, he felt within him the emptiness of a sanctuary without fire. She watched him warily. He picked up his tartan and shirt with the clumsy hands of a warrior who, for the first time, felt naked before a woman, not in flesh but in soul. He offered her his hand with a restrained gesture. "Come." "Where?" asked Dòrnait, her clear eyes lit with a mix of curiosity and fear. "To the water. There you can tell me what you came to say." She nodded with a motion as light as a feather brushing an altar. She walked beside him among stones covered in lichen, weaving through ferns and shrubs, until they reached a cove where the sea of the Firth of Lorn gently lapped the coast. Instead of approaching the white sand, Dòrnait veered toward a grey rock. The air smelled of salt and heather, with that trace of ancient dampness that seemed to have seeped in from the time of the Druids. Aodhgall removed his boots, left his clothes on a smooth stone, and stepped into the water. The sea was cold as St. Columba's hand delivering judgment, yet comforting. As if the sacred waters of the island of Iona were washing away the sin of his wrath. He swam for a while, letting the currents cool the heat of battle. When he emerged, Dòrnait was watching him. Her eyes were like the secret locks of sky, deep blue streaked with green, full of unspoken things. He felt desired. And desire, like every primal force, disarmed him. The sun was casting long shadows on the rock when she asked, "Is that the Isle of Skye?" "The northern tip. And Rùm just behind it to the west," he replied as he dressed. She nodded with a murmur of unease. "Then Terbert is near." And so was the threat that hung over them. Aodhgall could feel it. His enemy's name was like a dark cloud over the plain, heavy, swollen with uncertain fate. "What did you want to tell me?" Dòrnait's gaze turned more vulnerable. She rubbed her hands together, and for a moment she seemed more fragile than the flutter of a bird in a storm. "Roisiel isn't well." He straightened as if a spear had pierced between his shoulder blades. "What's wrong with her?" "Her heart is in pieces." Aodhgall clenched his teeth. He couldn't afford that luxury. Emotions were a luxury no clan chief could indulge in. Every decision had to be like a clean sword stroke. There was no room for tenderness when hundreds depended on his resolve. "She'll get over it." "You can't mean that." "I always mean what I say." "Then you don't know what you're doing." The fury, still simmering beneath his skin, nearly surged again. But she continued, unwavering, like an ancient priestess guarding a sacred fire. She spoke of love, of duty, of fathers who ruined their daughters for the sake of alliances. And when she mentioned her mother, her voice shifted. The breeze turned colder, as if the spirit of Tuathla Cambrach still wandered among the heather. Aodhgall listened in silence. She spoke of the soul's slow death, of wives treated like currency, of laughter extinguished beneath the yoke of obedience. She spoke without tears, but with a melancholy that pierced the flesh. "She was all I had," Dòrnait whispered. The sea roared behind her. The castle rose dark against a sky already painted with the first shadows of dusk. There she stood, fragile and unyielding, like a figure carved from ivory, alone among the stones of a land that wasn't hers. "What are you offering me?" he asked, swept away by a force more powerful than the tide. She stepped back but stumbled, and he caught her. In his arms he felt her tremble, as if the electric current of emotion was wrapping around them both. He kissed her with the fury of a Celtic god, and the need of a man standing at the edge of an abyss. His tongue sought hers, urgently. Desire possessed him, like an ancient spirit rising from the stone circles to claim an old debt. And yet, even as pleasure consumed him, something within him fractured. That passion was a challenge, yes, but also a promise. A promise of change. Of surrender. And Aodhgall MacCraith was not a man used to surrendering. Chapter 11. Holy God, it was like a spell. A damned beautiful spell. Aodhgall had known there would be a spark between them, But never had he imagined being swept away by a tide of such depth, a whirlwind of desire, of unexpected tenderness, of a passion born not just from the body but from the soul. It wasn't enough. Every inch of her skin called to him, and he answered as if his lips could memorize her. He kissed her with reverence, brushing her cheeks, the hollow of her throat, savoring every millimeter of that living warmth, as if he could carve it into his very being. Dòrnait melted against him, yielding but not weak. Her hands moved over him like they knew him, firm and gentle, clinging to his shoulders, his back, as if anchoring herself in that moment. And he felt her burn. Her passion rose in time with his, answering his kisses with a surrender that disarmed him. Her lips were sweet, almost innocent, yet there was an intensity in them that drove him mad. He wanted more. He plunged his tongue into her mouth with trembling hunger, while his hands moved up to her breasts, caressing them with a blend of awe and reverence. The corset kept him from feeling them fully, but the shape, the weight, her response, it was more than he had imagined. His thumb brushed the stiffened tip of her nipple, and the soft moan that escaped her lips shook him to his core. It was too much. And still not enough. Those stifled moans, the way she arched into him, silent prayers that set him ablaze. He pulled her by the hips, pressing her against him, and a gasp escaped as he felt her so close, her body firm and her desire pulsing, barely restrained. She rubbed against him, instinctive, powerful, and for a moment he thought his legs might give out. He wanted to open her, to fill her, to guide her to the trembling edge of pleasure, and hear her scream his name. He had never wanted anything more. Never with such urgency, with such wild devotion that left him exposed, vulnerable. When she melted into him, when she touched him, kissed him, she could have asked for anything. She could have broken him with a whisper. Damn her. Aodhgall pulled away suddenly, as if fleeing the blade of a knife, and a guttural sound escaped his throat as he struggled to reclaim the control that slipped further with every heartbeat. His body burned. No one had ever made him feel so threatened. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice hoarse, and the moment he heard himself he regretted the question. She gasped, still trembling. Her eyes, wide and luminous, searched his, and Aodhgall saw the impact of what had just happened, that moment of fusion, of surrender, of raw truth. She had no answers. Her lips parted. "I don't know." And there it was. The crack he could slip through. He should feel triumphant. She wanted him. He had won. But no, this wasn't victory. He felt hollow. Defeated. Dòrnait turned and began climbing the hill back to the fortress. Before the shadows swallowed her, he caught a glimpse of her face. What he saw there chilled him, fear. Not of him, but of what they had awakened. She wanted him as fiercely as he wanted her. She couldn't pretend otherwise. He had meant to teach her a lesson. But he was the one left marked. Burned by the very fire he had unleashed. She was already buried deep within him, where weapons were useless. And he didn't like it. He couldn't allow it. He mustn't. Dòrnait moved with determined steps over the rocks, as if each stride were a shield. "Dòrnait," he called. She stopped. She didn't turn. "Next time you make me an offer like that, I won't refuse it." She shivered. And ran. Chapter 12. The room in the east wing, once the quiet study of the castle's laird, now echoed with the rough chords of a bagpipe, while the crackle of the hearth mingled its warmth with the music. Outside, the Atlantic wind swept the coast like a wandering spirit, bringing with it the sea's salt and the whispers of the land's old gods. Dunsagothan, that time-worn fortress of stone blackened by centuries of storms, seemed alive that afternoon, lit by golden light slanting through its narrow windows. "Ow! You just stepped on my toe, you oaf!" Urani's protest rang out more theatrical than hurt, though her frown looked as though it had been carved by the hands of an old Celtic bard. Dòrnait stifled a smile. The scene had a touch of courtly farce, but with the wild grace of the Highlands. Echan, her stoic companion, murmured under his breath and shifted about like a fawn trapped in a marble hall. I warned you, milady, he muttered without quite raising his voice. Court dances aren't for warriors. We're not made to move like we've got an ash branch shoved up our. He stopped at Dòrnait's arched look. Not long ago, she would have said the same. But something in her heart had changed. There was something sacred in the teaching of it, as if passing on the dance was also a way of blessing the place, of bringing a touch of beauty and order to the castle's stony chaos. For days now she had been organizing those lessons with almost pious dedication. Dance, reading, writing in Scots, rudimentary Latin, as if the clan's daughters were part of some secret mission. The old laird's room, dressed in stacked books, scrolls, and maps of the old world, had come alive again. It wasn't a library yet, but it looked more like a shrine to learning than any hall of arms. Warrior, Uranie scoffed under her breath, provocative as a will-o'-the-wisp in the forest. Echan took a step toward her, serious as a young Norse god, with that fury that didn't yet know whether it was wounded pride or something sharper. Dòrnait stepped between them, light and firm as a wind-blessed banner. Echan, you're not doing badly at all. She smiled at him with that gentle firmness that brooked no argument. It was Uranie who missed the step. Isn't that right, Uranie? The girl pressed her lips together. The spark of rebellion danced in her eyes, but she understood she was close to being left without a partner. And finding men willing to dance had proven harder than any battlefield skirmish. Alastair, Aodhgall's cousin, had offered Echan as a human shield to avoid stepping in himself, swearing through gritted teeth he'd rather scrub latrines than prance like a lowlands peacock. Yes, it was my fault, Uranie finally admitted, her voice honeyed, though her eyes still sparkled with restrained threat. Knowing how to dance doesn't blunt a sharp tongue, Echan grumbled, aiming the comment more at Dòrnait than the girl with sarcasm rather than spite. Especially with lowlanders. Dòrnait bit back a laugh. The boy was sharper than he let on. That forgotten corner of the castle, among frayed tapestries and stone floors cold as tombs, had become a threshold. There, where echoes of the past still drifted, they were reclaiming something they may never have truly had, choice. The sound of the bagpipe rose again. Duncan, the piper, had shifted into a livelier rhythm. Dòrnait turned to call Roisiel, who remained by the window, her face turned to the cliffs that dropped to the sea, toward the misty horizon where sky slept. She wrapped a warm arm around her. Come on, don't give up, she whispered, and though she spoke of the dance, the words were a deeper prayer. Roisiel nodded, melancholy. Dòrnait thought of Coannach, of Rùm, of forbidden love and choices that weighed like millstones. She knew she had to convince Rùm, Aodhgall, even if the thought of it disoriented her more than she cared to admit. As the reel resumed, their steps traced an imperfect but vibrant circle. Dòrnait felt her heart flutter in her chest, a strange mix of joy and anxiety. She had begun to care. Not just for the girls, nor for the ancient stronghold of Dun Sagathan, which stood atop its promontory like an ancestral guardian. She cared for him. Since that kiss, she had become a nest of questions. He stirred in her emotions that terrified her: hunger, desire, tenderness, and something deeper. Something even the holy books or the old druidic legends couldn't name without touching the sacred. He gave her shivers of pleasure with a single glance. She felt vulnerable, yes, but also safe, as if his presence alone could keep all the world's demons at bay. And yet, she was his prisoner. That day on the beach, she had seen a small boat moored below the cliffs. Sky was close. A moonless night, maybe. But something held her back. Not fear. Something deeper. Something like roots. As if an invisible bond, woven from old oaths and forgotten gods, tied her to this land. Maybe it was simply that she no longer believed her brother would come. Terbert wouldn't rescue her. She had never been his priority, and that hurt more than she cared to admit. Echan grumbled when Dòrnait asked him to try the volta again. Come on, she said, taking his hand. This time with the lift, like when Queen Elizabeth danced with Lord Leicester. The whole court talked about it for months. Bloody English, muttered Echan, more out of habit than conviction. Uranie burst out laughing. And Roisiel did too, for the first time in weeks. Then, as if a Celtic wind had swept the sorrow away, the mood shifted. Laughter rang like bells. The walls, once heavy and grey, seemed to shrink. For a moment, Dun Sagathan was no longer a prison or a fortress or a ruin, it was a home. A sanctuary between two worlds. I don't think Aodhgall would let us go to court. Uranie sighed, the anger gone from her voice. If you go as my guests, he won't be able to refuse, said Dòrnait, her smile radiant. I'll stay at one of my cousin's houses in Edinburgh. I'll take care of everything. Roisiel murmured something barely audible, but Dòrnait understood. The conflict between duty and desire lived in every heart. In hers too. Because deep down, she already knew. Aodhgall MacCraith's kiss had changed something. And not just in her skin. It had awakened a fate she didn't yet know would be hers, or her undoing. Love is the ground that sustains. Love doesn't always arrive like an epic storm or the song of forgotten gods. Sometimes it's subtler. More human. It feels like a house swept at dawn, like hands stacking firewood in silence, like a quiet shared where no one runs from themselves. Because true love, the kind that transforms, that heals, isn't just a burning promise, it's a steady practice. It's presence. It's order. It's choosing to face things even when it hurts and still staying. Many of us run from that kind of love, not because we don't want it, but because it feels unfamiliar. If we were raised in chaos, calm can seem dangerous. If all we've known is distance, tenderness can feel like a threat. But Gaia, the living earth that holds us, teaches another way. She doesn't judge disorder, she embraces and renews it. She doesn't demand perfection, only presence. In this more grounded, more real kind of love, there's space for contradiction. We can be broken, and still be worthy of love. We can be afraid, and still choose to stay. True love doesn't erase our shadows, it lights them with compassion. Like moonlight on the cliffs, it doesn't remove the stone but makes it visible. Maybe the greatest act of love isn't to declare it in words, but to tend to the everyday with care. Maybe that's what loving is, honoring the life we build together as if we're tending an invisible garden, day by day, soul to soul. Chapter 13. Castle of Dunbray, western coast of Aodhg, Scotland. Year of our Lord 1610. The room, after the others had departed, had become too small for so much tension. The very stones of the chamber, dark and damp like the bowels of a cliff, seemed to lean toward them as silent witnesses to what was about to happen. Dòrnait's face, still flushed from the dance and something deeper, something older, glowed like an oil lamp in the dimness. There was something fiercely vulnerable about her, like the white heron flying alone at dawn over a fog-covered lake. Aodhgall watched her with the intensity of a penitent before the altar, aware that his fate was in part in those small, determined hands. I haven't done anything I didn't think was just, she murmured at last, as if confessing something to a priest in the crypts of an abbey. Some of your wives have more fear than desire, and that seemed like an injustice to me. Aodhgall narrowed his eyes. Through the high Gothic window, the sky was tinged with the leaden grey of a distant storm. The distant moan of the sea wind could be heard, like a funeral song sung by the city on the hills. The fairies of the West, the clan elders called them, bearers of omens and ancient secrets. And you decided to correct it. The injustice, he said gravely. Someone had to, she replied defiantly. But beneath her firm tone, a current of doubt slipped through. Aodhgall noticed it, and without meaning to, his anger fused with something else, admiration, perhaps desire, maybe something deeper he wanted to bury. You are not the lady of this castle, he reminded her, stepping forward. Someone has to be, she replied, not stepping back. Outside, the wind howled more fiercely, slipping between the castle walls like a breath of the ancient gods. Somewhere on the island, a raven croaked. The same sound that, according to the MacCraith clan legends, heralded the fall of King Diarmaid centuries ago, when he defied the fate set by the fates. Aodhgall watched her silently. Dòrnait had no armor, no clans at her back, but there was in her a will forged with the same hardness as the old Pictish swords buried beneath the turf. In that moment, with her hair loose from the dance, her breath heavy, and the fire in her eyes, she didn't seem like a noble fallen from grace, but a beautiful and fierce banshee, come from the other world to alter everything. "I'm going to tell you something you won't like," Aodhgall said, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. "The time for dancing is over. The time for games is over too. I need my wife now." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "That we'll marry this very week. Not for politics, not for your counsel to the women of the clan, but because I need you. Because you, Dòrnait MacCuinn, have turned this fortress into a home, and that is something no battle of mine has ever given me." For the first time, Dòrnait seemed at a loss for words. She looked at him with eyes like ancient lakes, murky and deep. Her soul wrestled between surrender and pride. It wasn't just the proposal, not even the desire, that confused her, but the possibility of belonging. Of staying. "And if I refuse?" she whispered. "You won't," he replied, taking the final step between them. Their bodies were separated by little more than a breath. The heat of the hearth crackled behind them, but it was the warmth of their proximity that ignited the atmosphere. He raised a hand and brushed a lock of hair from her face with the tenderness of one blowing ash off a relic. Dòrnait didn't move. Her whole body was tense, like a deer at the edge of the clearing, scenting danger and desire. "I don't want to force you," he continued. "But if you don't come to me willingly, then you'll have to do so by fate. Fate. Mine is at stake, and that of my clan too. The monks of Iona say that God moves the pieces, but I know that sometimes, fate is pushed by the living." She swallowed. Outside, the sky rumbled with a dry thunderclap, and a lightning bolt tore through the evening like a prophecy. For an instant, the whole castle seemed to hold its breath. "What if I can't be what you need?" she finally said, in a thread of voice. "Then we'll learn together how to be," he answered. Then it happened. Dòrnait didn't move closer. She didn't leap into his arms. She only closed her eyes. And that gesture, that small surrender, was all Aodhgall needed. He embraced her tightly, tenderly, with a passion that seemed torn from the very heart of the earth. It wasn't a kiss of desire, though it burned with it. It was one of pact. Of renunciation and promise. Of roots dug into soil that sometimes bleeds but also blooms. When they separated, Dòrnait let out a sigh, and it was as if she had finally released an ancient burden. "All right, the wedding," she murmured. "But don't expect me to stay silent after." Aodhgall smiled for the first time in weeks. "By the ancient gods, Dòrnait, if you ever stayed silent, the world would stop." And high in the tower, the castle bell began to toll with force. Someone was approaching from the south. Ally or enemy? They wouldn't know until it was too late.